Hi, welcome everybody. I'm here with Chris Hornick. He is the founder of HBSC Strategic Services and also of the HBSC Leadership Institute. And we're here to talk about his new book, The Last Book of Leadership. So it's a book that I've really enjoyed, and I'm excited to talk with you about it today.
Great. It's great to be here, Bill.
So I wonder before we dive in, I have a lot of notes of things that I'm curious to kind of dig into. Could you give us like a really brief elevator pitch on what makes this book different than other leadership models? And maybe just giving us a sense of that.
I think the primary reason for this book is really to create a unified, holistic model of leadership. There's a lot of sort of unitary books that talk about one leadership concept and really focus on elements of leadership that are directed at a very specific type of leadership. And this book, what the design of this book was really so that we're talking about leadership in a universal type of environment, regardless of context. So whether you're a police captain or you're a captain of a football team or you're the president of the United States or president of Ukraine, we really wanted to create a model that was consistent regardless of what type of leader you are and would actually speak to the various branches of leadership that are out there and basically bring it all together. And so hence the name of the book is The Last Book of Leadership. And the goal here was to create something that if you're only going to read one book of leadership, either an edition or if you're only going to read one period, this would be the book that would provide value to you as a leader.
Yeah, I love that. And I have a few of the things that I really enjoyed about it. I think that was the most important piece was that you integrated a lot of different leadership styles from different contexts. So you can see what might be effective being the president of Ukraine might not be as effective when you are the manager of a small team and a company. So I think that really hit home. And then, something that comes to mind is the philosopher Ken Wilber saying that a lot of different ideologies and philosophies often have some truth, but they're partial. And I feel like what this book did a really good job was you tried to bring as many of those models in as together as possible, so it feels much more holistic. Another thing I was curious about to hear more about was this idea of post-ideological thinking. Could you speak a little bit more to that and how that's important for leaders?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think ideology, approximately, say, 500 years ago, sort of the concept of ideology came into play, and there were a lot of ideological leaders that came about, throughout history, especially in Europe. Very diverse group of ideologies that actually come out of, that region. And the interesting thing about ideologies is that in order to design an ideology, you really do need a common set of beliefs about, history, about, like our history, collective history. You need to actually define what are the right and wrong, which are your values. And an ideology also talks about sort of an ideal future. And
Mm.
so if you can get people to buy into an ideology, it's incredibly powerful. I mean, the clash of ideologies have actually created world wars because people are actually looking at, hey, our set of values and beliefs and ideals of the future are in conflict with others. And so an ideological war, basically, during World War II, it killed 75 million people. So you can sort to see the power of ideology and the problems when ideologies clash. And so really when we talk about a post-ideological society and a post-ideological world, we're really saying that, the ideology that we need is a pro-humanity ideology, pro-social ideology that basically takes into account like a holistic future for everyone, as opposed to actually having individual ideologies, at conflict, because ideology, it can be divisive, unfortunately.
Mm. Yeah, so it makes sense. So leaders, maybe in the past, being an ideological leader was effective, but it sounds like that's being less effective now, and leaders have to kind of evolve out of that and see things a little bit more nuanced.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, the other thing I really liked was the idea of the 10 leadership archetypes in the book. Could you talk a little bit like what are those and what is the importance of those in the model?
Yeah, as we talked about at the opening, I think a lot of leadership is really context sensitive. And
Mm.
so, like if you're in a crisis situation, you may actually lead with more authority. If you're in a creative situation, you would obviously want to lead with more inspiration. And, so basically, based on your context, you are going to modulate your behavior. And I think the key thing is that on the authority side, we actually designed the model to basically have 10 different leader archetypes. And on the authority side, there was really sort of the dictator, who's the sort of the extreme authoritarian. Down from there was the commander. Then we have the decision maker. Then we have the change agent. Then the ideologue, who is very focused on rules, wanting to follow the rules all the time. And then from there, we get into more of the inspirational side of this curve. And then you talk about the builders and the team captains. They're in sports figures, team captains tend to have both authority as well as inspiration. And then we have the visionaries, the spiritual leaders. And then on the low side of like the curve is really the martyrs. And those actually are the folks who are actually leading totally by inspiration. And unfortunately, they don't have a lot of positional power. And so sometimes when you find yourself, Alexei Navalny, someone like that, who's basically in prison in Russia, you find you really don't have any positional power whatsoever. So your only method of leading is really on the inspiration side, and leading with sort of ethical power. That's how basically a person in that position would have to lead. And so really when you talk about this continuum, each individual leader has a primary, secondary, and tertiary leadership type where they can operate in. And I think you've taken the test as well, like to basically determine your leadership type. Out of those three, when we operate in any of those three leadership types or archetypes, basically that's where you can operate as an authentic leader.
Yeah, and I think that was another idea that I really liked, this idea of leadership being context dependent. So that of those 10 different styles, some of them work really well in certain contexts, but when the context change, they might be very ineffective. So that kind of comes back to this other idea that you bring up in the book about metacognitive awareness.
Yes.
Could you talk about the importance of metacognitive awareness, and how does that awareness help leaders to know, is it their leadership style or what's appropriate, or any other way that might help somebody be an effective leader?
Yeah, the concept of metacognitive awareness is sort of a key to modern leadership today. It's really self-awareness, and it's having this ability to really be empathic and really sort of understand what's going on around you so you can modulate your own behavior. So, there's a lot of words for it out there. I think mindfulness is one. There's self-awareness is a big thing, like obviously that people talk about. But it really is this ability to sort of be emotionally intelligent and really emotional state management that you have even when things are falling apart, right? So it's very easy to be, like a leader. I think that, there's a saying in the book, anyone can hold the helm when the seas are calm. But when we actually get into, like sort of difficult leader situations where maybe you need to allocate scarcity or, allocate loss to various groups. There's throughout history, the generals and the leaders of nations have had to allocate loss when there's scarcity and when bad things happen.
Great. No, that's all really helpful. And then that also seems related to the other idea that I want to bring up around operational range. I think that was an idea that I hadn't seen in another leadership book before. Could you speak of what is operational range and why is that important for leaders?
Yeah, as we were talking about, I think the element of operational range basically means that you can operate in a diversity of situations, maintain appropriate emotional state, but sort of there's inputs and outputs of this. And really, so the inputs are being situationally aware, self-aware, and having a strong identity that is not negatively impacted by sort of the circumstances that you're dealing with. And really, it's the ability to modulate how you use power, adapt your leadership type. And it also talks about your process and how you communicate, being able to adapt that. And really the whole, genre of sort of operational range really talks about adaptive behavior. So if you're a leader and you can adapt your behavior to the appropriate situation so that you're a leader in harmony with what's going on and you can act appropriately in those various situations, then you have high operational range. And how that actually relates to the unified leadership types is the fact that, if you can be both a commander as well as a spiritual leader, you have absolute, wonderful operational range, and you're a very effective leader in multiple contexts. If you're a leader who's basically mainly, or I'd say not only, but only focused on inspiration, you're sort of kind of sometimes in certain situations, you may not be the ideal leader. Similarly, if you're only an authoritarian all the time, then basically in creative environments where there's not scarcity or there's not a major problem, you really won't be able to foster the creativity that you really should in a particular situation. So really, this operational range is basically having a range of where you can be authoritative in certain circumstances and you can be inspirational in others.
Yeah, and that comes back to this idea of metacognitive awareness and being aware of both yourself and the situation. So it sounds like leaders need to know, when is it appropriate where I have to step up and be a strong leader, even potentially like a dictator, maybe in a smaller way if there's a crisis, versus being more of an inspirational leader. So it sounds like, someone who's only relying on inspiration is probably not going to get that far as a leader when times are changing, because sometimes that's just not an effective leadership type in certain contexts.
And that's a great observation, because there's even a story about a colonel in the army in the book, and one of the things he actually underscores is really to have presence, to have leadership presence. You really need to understand when to intervene and when not to. Really sometimes you need to intervene because the situation requires it. And sometimes it's best to sort of stay on the sidelines and let people sort of grow as leaders. And, really a lot of that has to do with sort of metacognitive awareness, both of situation and self. Because are you intervening as a manager because you're a micromanager, or are you intervening because the situation requires it? So that's sort of where the wisdom of leadership comes in as well.
Well, that actually hits on another thing I was going to ask you about, is just the importance of wisdom, which is something that you seem to emphasize. So that seems like a central part of this model. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, really, leadership wisdom is at the foundation of this model. So there's really 5 elements that are sort of foundational to this model. The first is context. The second is vision. The third is leadership wisdom. And the fourth is power. And the fifth is really outcome. But leadership wisdom, the foundation of leadership wisdom is really the ability to build trust with your followers. And building trust with your follower really falls into 3 different categories. So in order to build trust, you need character. So basically, if you're a good character, people will follow you. If you have competency, people will follow and trust you. And basically, if you have presence, then basically people will feel a connection with you. And then, obviously, you will gain trust through those 3 elements. And there's obviously the character element is key, because people want to know, do you have good intent? Do you care about them? Do you really have conviction in what you're, espousing? And really, can you provide clarity to the group? It's also they also want to know whether you have integrity. Like, integrity is going to be critical for people to sort of trust you and trust your character. And then on the competency side, it really is capability. So do you have sort of the skill, the knowledge, the expertise? And, really, have you created a reputation that you're a competent leader? That's critical. And then last on the presence, we talked about, sort of the ability to have courage and demonstrate courage, because, obviously courage is contagious. And, really, do you have the strength and perseverance to really push through the difficult times? And then the last element of presence really is, do you have that connection with followers? So do you have sort of charismatic interactions with people? And really, do they have a sense that they have sort of a one-on-one relationship with you, even though you may have relations with thousands of people, of subordinates? They have this sort of personal connection with you. So that's where basically, leadership trust and wisdom comes from, is that ability to generate that trust.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then it's interesting because on the other end of the spectrum, or I don't know if you'd call it a spectrum, is power. And I think sometimes people think that power is different than wisdom, but you're integrating both. Can you talk more about the importance of power in this model?
Yeah, it's very important to have wisdom, but really you want wisdom in action. And so really when we talk about, leadership power, all the leaders in this book were very powerful people. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the problems that with a lot of different leadership philosophies is really saying, positional power is a bad thing, right? If you lead by position, and I agree, if you lead solely by positional power, that is not good. right? In certain circumstances, you may have to lead by positional power if it's a crisis, like, so if it's a 9/11 type thing, you may need positional power. But, really, that's only a part of the picture, but it is part of the picture. And so, really the ethical power is important. So, really having that ability to say to people, hey, this is actually right and just, and you should follow me because what I am actually leading you towards is right and just. And then there's also the side of it where there's personal power, which is more sort of your information that you have, and basically, your ability to build relationships and, connect with people. So really those three different types of power, personal, ethical, and positional, that's the total picture of power. And sort of nullifying, a lot of leadership, elements, or I'll say, books out there tend to nullify the positional side, but it's one more tool that you have as a leader. And it is appropriate in certain circumstances. I think anyone who leads solely by positional power is a bad leader, but it is a tool.
And again, coming back to that idea of operational range, there are times where that's appropriate and there's times where that's not appropriate. But leaders ultimately need the wisdom along with the power to discern the difference.
Yeah. So to your point, basically, if you have the power and you have no wisdom, then that's bad.
Well, speaking of that, maybe the best example of that in the book, which is kind of interesting and provocative that you did this, but you also profiled Adolf Hitler. Yes. And so that was another thing I was surprised, because there's all these inspirational leaders, like Nelson Mandela, for example, or the Dalai Lama. And then right alongside that, there's analysis of Hitler. I found that fascinating. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about why did you choose to analyze him, and what did you learn analyzing him with this model?
Yeah. I mean, I think, that was sort of a debate point about whether to include a person like Hitler in this book. And I really think, any leadership model that is sort of holistic and, unified in nature would have to actually sort of classify Hitler and understand, and at least have an understanding or be able to sort of explain leaders who are, dark triad leaders, right? And, I think the elements of dark triad are really sort of being Machiavellian, which Hitler certainly was. He was a narcissist, and in some cases, he was an extreme of being a psychopath.
Yeah.
So really, when you talk about that, if you have a model of leadership that doesn't really sort of classify that type of leadership, he was also a dictator, and he was a commander, and he was a decision maker, like in the model. And so, as you can tell, he was an extreme on the authority side, and he consolidated power, and he had a bad, like a evil ideology. And so, like, you can start to see that basically the mix of those elements could lead to disaster. And that's one of the reasons why I thought it was important that, historical leaders like Hitler were actually analyzed through the ULM scorecard.
Yeah, I found it interesting too, even looking at the image that you had where you ranked him on these different things and how it just looked so off, because he was so strong in that power and using ideology, but just had no morals, very low wisdom. So you can see how problematic it is if somebody's so unbalanced.
Yeah. One of the things I was going to bring up specifically about what you just said was that, he was so unbalanced. And when you start to look at him as a person, I know, you and I have had conversations about IFS, internal family systems. And really, a person like Hitler, he was probably living out trauma from his childhood or some difficult period in his life. And unfortunately, he got into a position of power, and he was a leader who never should have gotten into a position of power. But sort of desperate times, require the elements of desperate men and or women. And, he was unfortunately promoted into a position, and once he got there, he seized power and did terrible things. And so really you can see that, like the trauma inside him basically came out in the world, and that's an unfortunate, very unfortunate period in history.
Yeah, definitely. And I also think, personally reading the book, I was applying it to myself a lot and curious how I can be a better leader. But I think he's a perfect case study that we can hold leaders accountable and kind of look at some of these worst case scenarios so we can critique current leaders and try to see from the learn from the past of what is that toxic mix of leadership type and how and what that results in. And so I think that's something in terms of that rigid ideology and the lack of wisdom and the lack of characters is something to be really aware of, even in lesser ways in leaders that we have today.
No, and I 100% agree with that. I think that, obviously, if we forget the lessons of the past, we are destined to repeat them. So, yeah, I think it's important to do that analysis.
Definitely. So yeah, and then the other thing I was going to ask more, just kind of staying on this topic of psychology. So we're looking at that one extreme of the narcissism and psychopathy, but in terms of the other extreme of unified leaders. So what is like that healthy psychological makeup of somebody that's a unified leader that is really integrating all these different models, or at least some, on the path to that?
Yeah, I think the unified concept really comes down to is that they are a well-balanced, emotionally intelligent, value-based leader. And so, really what they're looking for, they're actually looking for the good of the collective as opposed to any type of divisive. They do not have visions of division, right? And so I think the unfortunate part in politics and a lot of things today, even countries, this divisiveness is the antithesis of really what unified leadership is all about. So it's really about bringing people together, seeing the collective good. And, a great leader in that regard was really Angela Merkel from Germany, Chancellor of Germany. She actually was sort of sat on top of a multicultural, group of folks all throughout Europe who have historically fought each other, fought world wars. And she was able to unify that group, regardless of cultural differences, regardless of financial differences. And she really sought the collective good. And she was a true humanitarian. And so she's one of the 5-star leaders in the books. We basically rate the leaders based on how many stars they have. But she was one of the 5-star leaders that are really a standout in the book. She was trusted by all the folks in Europe. She was sort of seeking coalitions, and long-term coalitions. She actually was the chancellor for 16 years, 4 terms, which is amazing. Mm-hmm. And she really was looking out, for sort of the good of the world, even over sort of just what was good for Europe. She was a true humanitarian. She accepted a lot of refugees into the country, and she was a huge player on the world stage in terms of humanitarian efforts. So, like overall, someone like her, I would actually point out is the poster person for unified leadership.
Yeah, so it's this great blend of competence, of power, of character, of wisdom.
Yes.
But then ultimately coming back to this idea of being post-ideological. So instead of being rigid about your group or your country, she really had more of a world-centric value system trying to unite people. So that seems like really important for leaders in general. That's kind of like that pinnacle of leadership. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Elon Musk is another person that you analyze in the book who's, very interesting. He's been in the news a lot, as always. Can you talk a little bit more about him and, obviously remarkably successful leader? Like what according to your analysis, what made him so successful?
Yeah, Elon is another one of the 5-star leaders out there. He had an obsession, basically with innovation and sort of changing humanity. And, he was able to build, at this point, probably 8 to 10 companies, all designed with, major visions for change. And in the most part, change that was going to impact at the humanity at scale, which is pretty amazing. So, overall, he actually does sort of, he tests very high in vision. He has very good contextual understanding. He executes in most cases with wisdom and very powerful. So he's leveraging all the different types of power, personal power. He's basically out there promoting his brand, ethical power, trying to save humanity, and then positional power in his companies, basically to sort of accelerate what the outcomes of these companies really are. And then if you look at sort of his track record on the outcome, he's actually been able to generate momentum in all these companies and run them simultaneously. And, all with the idea that basically it was going to be some type of pro-social outcome.
Mm.
And so, he's a master of sort of controlling the environment and changing the environment, and doing that rapidly, accelerating change, which is kind of amazing.
Interesting. And another thing related to Elon, I know he's been very interested in AI, and I know that artificial intelligence is something that we've talked about a lot. I'm just curious, generally speaking, like, what are your thoughts on AI in terms of the research that you've done on leadership? Like, how is that going to affect leadership?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to impact it in a significant way, and I think that there's sort of the short-term outlook on AI, and then the long-term outlook on AI. We've actually, from HBSC's perspective, we've actually been, implementing and sort of assessing AI technology for probably about 12, maybe 13 years, and really the value that AI has provided historically really was on sort of the operations side. So, included improving supply chain, improving marketing outcomes, really looking at how AI could actually impact your intelligence around HR. So that's sort of the short run. And it really helps leaders improve their decision making, right? And so really if you look at this historically, it's always been AI in service of humans. And I
Hmm.
think, like with sort of the generative language models, large language models that are out there today, I think we could see a time, probably within the next, 10 to 15 years where the tides are really turned. And I think AI actually, it's really humans in service of AI. And you could actually see AI being activated and sort of forming more action-based, outcomes,
Hmm.
which is sort of a danger. And I think that's where a lot of people are sort of raising the red flag right now, saying that, really we've reached this inflection point where AI can do things that humans cannot. And they've been doing that for a long time. But I think right now it's basically sort of as you make them action oriented and put them in the loop to basically execute things, that's where it becomes sort of an existential threat. And the interesting thing, I remember, like, I used to work on Wall Street, and working on Wall Street, I worked on it in the arbitrage area. And one of the interesting things about working on arbitrage is that sometimes the advantage that you had in the arbitrage world was sometimes like milliseconds. And so one of the reasons, if a human was in the loop making these decisions, they were too slow. And so one of the stories I always like to tell is that there were some Wall Street firms that basically moved their data centers closer to Wall Street so they could actually sort of reduce the latency in their decision making, and reduce the latency and basically automate a lot of these trades, in order to extract value. And so if you can just see that the incentive is there to reduce latency and activate these engines, that will happen. And unfortunately, it's a profit motive, right? So
Hmm.
a lot of this stuff, a lot of the danger is actually driven by sort of humanity's continual behaviors, and some of them are actually motivated by greed.
Yeah, it's interesting. So there's a few things we could pick up on there, but one is if there's a company that's being run by a leader, a human leader, we can evaluate that leader using this leadership model. But what you're saying is in the future, it could be 10 or 15 years, there could be even, let's say, a department of a company that is run by AI, and the AI is making decisions. So it's more that humans are in service of the AI's decision. Well, I mean, have you thought about what if we looked at AI through this leadership profiling? Like, is AI going to be a good leader, or how would we know if a certain AI was a good leader?
Well, certainly you could actually program, artificial intelligence with this, 24 elements of leadership. I think, and you basically could sort of control it with a model like this. Unfortunately, I think the challenge and sort of the state of the art of these generative AI type of elements is that they do tend to evolve. And so if you could actually ensure that the AIs had shared values, so that they value human life, and you ensure that they had common sense to not actually do something, not evolve in an improper way, and you could basically control the sort of the genie in the bottle here. If you could prove that, then I think we have a very good future I also look at this as though that there's a billion ways things can go wrong, and there's only a few ways that they can go right. And so that's why I think that, it's necessary to have strong leadership and people who are in the know and don't have the wrong incentives to basically control AI. Because, I mean, obviously, if you have, if you're in an arms race and, the $1 trillion prize is off a cliff and everybody's running as fast as they can towards that cliff to get that $1 trillion prize, everybody's going to go off the cliff. And I think that's basically what the problem is. The financial incentives here, a lot of the things that, are being developed. I mean, if you look at companies like Palantir, these are really military grade weapons. And, potentially some of this stuff should be released, and then some of the stuff actually needs to be kept under, tight controls. And I think that the challenge there is that there's not a lot of economic incentives to kind of control this like it should be.
Yeah, so I think we will need some leaders that are post-ideological in their thinking, that have the power to maybe guide some of this, and also the wisdom to kind of see the big picture. So yeah, it is a time, and like a lot of the leaders that you profile in your book, a lot of them came out of some very extreme historical circumstances. So yeah, hopefully we'll find some unified leaders that will help with all of this eventually.
Yeah, I think we need them fast. And I think that we're kind of we literally, I think atomic energy was the last sort of major inflection point that humanity had to sort of cope with at the scale. And, so we had Nuclear Regulatory Commission to control atomic energy. I think we need some type of, artificial intelligence regulatory commission to control this. And, sort of the wisdom that's necessary to do this needs to be pro-social and pro-humanity, as opposed to, specifically driven by capitalism.
Yeah, definitely. Well, this has been great. I don't know if there's anything else that you want to touch on, but I think we went over the points that I wanted to ask you about. But I really enjoyed the book, and how can people learn more about the work that you're doing and access the book?
Yeah, so we have a website, the last bookofleadership.com. And we also have, it's available on Amazon. It's available on Barnes and Noble. And there's a couple of videos up on YouTube, and you can take a look at if you want to learn more about unified leadership. But certainly, I hope you guys enjoyed the book, and it was a pleasure talking to you, Bill.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, take care.